Okay, welcome. Welcome to Wednesday office hours. This image, unfortunately, is slightly separate from what we're going to talk about, but part of the front end of this is to talk about or to rehearse Durand's work on fictitious capital. And just to remind us that there's a variety of things that constitute fictitious capital. It has basic categories like bank credit, public debt, company bonds, shares, and other miscellaneous projects. And it's important to note, of course, that it's tradable on the basis of capitalized revenues, that is, interest flows, and of course, dividend flows and ownership over the productive capital that firms will accumulate. So there's a lot more to fictitious capital than this. The notion that you might think of it only as fictive. So, without further ado, so I begin. There's even more notes. So we're still doing a quantum political economy, but we have new things to think about. A couple of new articles and a slightly different twist, which, and I've mentioned fictitious capital now because it it uh, it needs to be included. Let's say that the current thing I've been working at doesn't quite include fictitious capital yet. So fictitious capital is mentioned today, but it hasn't been fully integrated to what we might consider um, a quantum way of thinking. So we'll talk about the quantum stuff at front end today, and then uh, with a little bit of rehearsing um, Durand's book, more specifically on things that might be fictitious. And so hopefully those will come together next week. So, reason has always existed, but not always in a rational form. Meaning is revealed in context, but not absolutely determined by it. And this is that incompleteness that comes this kind of quantizable, as it were, gap. And we'll look at a couple of reasons to look at that. And of course, we got diverted this week, partially because the LLM decided that the models we were working with were largely metaphorical, and so that um, forced us to go back and think about the relationship between models, analogies, and metaphors. And the point is, of course, that science engages in metaphors as well. Otherwise, we wouldn't have all these strange things about cats and boxes and stuff like that. So it's not trivial, but it is important to sort of work through that, particularly since we're building models and that they require, at a certain level, metaphor, but we shouldn't be sort of trapped by thinking about it in that way, even though others have indulged that kind of construction. So it's not to say that's not the way to look at it, but that you know we should be more serious about it. Let's put it that way. All right. Sorry for that little. So we got quotes which may linger in the final result, and so um, everything in the future is a wave. Everything in the past is a particle. This is Sir William Lawrence Bragg, the Nobel Prize winner in physics in 1915. And we move further ahead to Richard Feynman in 1981. Nature isn't classical, damn it. And if you want to make a simulation of nature, you'd better make it quantum mechanical. So, obviously, this is the difference a near century makes in thinking about certain items. Even though Bragg, of course, is talking also about a quantum thing. You could say we haven't gone too far, but we have actually. The beauty or whatever ugliness is that our computational ability is improved, and we have new measurement units that are not necessarily universal, but that apply in a variety of technologies, like the qubit, for example. I'm not going to talk about that today. But the idea of quantum has, of course, been picked up by a lot of people. For example, someone in international relations, like James Derderian. This is a quote from a more recent book of his that tries to insert quantum into, international relations theory. And there it functions more metaphorically, but it does raise certain ideas that still relate to the technology and to the more material elements of what we're thinking about. So, in quantum, the measurement problem is further complicated, if not upended, by the uncertainty principle, which elevates an epistemological problem into an ontological paradox. That is, until observed or measured, we cannot know if Schrodinger's famous cat is dead, alive, or getting a quadrillion hits on YouTube across the multiverse. So that's a little flippant, one could say, but it is a way in which we can think about this. Now, more recently, there are texts that attempt to take quantum at the, if in fact quantum operates at a metaphorical level, and in the construction of models, we assume we make certain cognitive assumptions, then Bussmeyer and Bruce's book addresses in a much more clearly mathematical way how to accommodate that in a variety of research. So they're including, Bayesian stuff, ways in which we can talk about probability, etc. Now, I'm not recommending you read that book necessarily, but it has been referenced for some other things, and provides, I think, in one particular channel, as it were, a way in which we can think about this by way of working through the analogy, metaphor, model problem. So Bussmeyer and Bruce say classical systems assume that measurement merely observes a pre-existing property of a system. In contrast, quantum systems assume that measurement actively creates the existence of a property in a system. So that's very different. And you can see, if you've been thinking about this a little bit, is that it appears, and this is, maybe overstepping the meaning, but that you could call a kind of subjectivity, that is, when measurement actively creates the existence of a property in a system, it is, to go back to the what Derderian was talking about, is this epistemological problem turns ontological, and in that same way allows for greater subjectivity, whatever that means. Noting, of course, that this is, and one could easily assume that this is the kind, well, I think so anyway, the same idea that we have in other kinds of discussions of radical subjectivity, like Frankfurt School, for example, that discussions of large-scale human movements can be talked about in ways that, there's a lot of, well, not a lot of, there are attempts to measure or assess radical subjectivity, and I think that quantum is another way of thinking about it, not the way of thinking about it, but it allows us to note certain communication issues that we looked at prior to that. Now, as you know, I've been using a LLM to hallucinate, and it really does hallucinate, as I've discovered, because really need to be comprehensive about putting data in, because it moves in certain logical directions, and once you see that it kind of moves mechanically, particularly in the first instance, as I've mentioned before, that it tends to make certain weird judgments on the first try, and if you to prove to it that you sort of know what you're talking about, it does a better job on the second try. Not of the same thing, but you sort of have to ask a follow-up question. So it's always the first try always looks weird. I mean, it throws lots of words in, but it doesn't. It's working from a corpus, but it doesn't quite put them all together correctly. It has well, with respect, certain semantic problems that are symptomatic of what an LLM, how an LLM operates. So anyway, so if you have a quantum economic concept of capital, you can contrast traditional political economy, that is the fixed quantity moving through linear circuits, that is this idea of Department 1, Department 2, and then in a quantum political economy view, QPE, there is superposition, that is multiple potential values until measured. So there is we're talking about potentiality, talking about probabilities, etc. It's not as fixed as the numbers we would use in a traditional political economy approach. And we need to understand superposition better. And this does require a little bit more quantitative application. So rent in a quantum economic concept, now this is where the LLM doesn't quite work it through, but it describes from a traditional political economy view, rent as a secondary circuit barrier. Now that may just be a hallucination, but it is this idea that it's not seen as indirect, as something which is not fully capital. But as I've asserted before, that rent can be considered capital because it represents, or it, for a variety of legal reasons, represents other things, other capital-like forms, and we talked about this before about that it can be seen as a variety of promised assets, however intangible. But even that dichotomy is problematic, the tangible versus intangible, as I discussed before. So under a quantum political economy view, the primary circuit mechanism that can be reconfigured. So what the LLM was doing here, and I don't want to spend all this time trying to interpret the LLM, we're going to do other things, but it decided, because rent was secondary, that the primary circuit mechanism under quantum, it breaks open, that is, in this more indeterminate way, allows things to be reconfigured. And so, since in this particular pass at the LLM, I introduced a certain set of legal issues, which I had introduced before in terms of development rights, you could see where it was headed. So, property rights, that is, under a traditional political economy view, are fixed objective attributes. And the point I was making with critical legal studies was that there is more, and this is consonant with the literature, that it is more indeterminate, or has more uncertainty built into it, and hence can be open to a more quantum viewpoint. That is, quantum wave functions with probability distributions. Now, this is the difference between, well, without getting into a thing, this is sort of the point of doing quantum stuff, is to look at certain ways in which probability operates, and it shifts from a more static to a more dynamic, and even that's a problematic dichotomy in a quantum model. So measurement as a quantum economic concept under traditional political economy would refer to market transactions, and which we don't leave. I mean, that market transactions occur and they need to be measured, but under a quantum economy view, you don't just have market transactions, you have legal adjudications that collapse quantum states. Now, what the hell does that mean? The point is that you have not only market transactions, but you have legal adjudications, which has to do with either contracts, receipts, all kinds of agreements, other kinds of things that are part of a market transaction or that are sit in superposition, as it were, to market transactions. So far be it from me to try and explain LLM hallucinations. So let's get on to something more solid and more concrete. So Duran on fictitious capital, not to fully rehearse this, is just a section from it. But the point is that fictitious capital has multiple elements, as I mentioned when we just first started, that include debt, credit, a variety of representations of shares, promissory elements, all kinds of stuff. It's not just one thing, and fictitious capital is just sort of a covering term for a variety of things. And what's interesting is that these things can become commodities, and they have become commodities. One can assert that the Great Recession of 2007-2008 was symptomatic of that kind of set of relations. So, how does the creation of fictitious capital work? So, the formation of fictitious capital is known as capitalization. Now, that's not synonymous, but I think it's important to consider that that kind of is what it is. And capitalization's relation to valorizing, etc., is maybe more the critical element. That is, it produces debts or securities whose value results from the capitalization of the anticipated revenues. Now, this is this whole business where if you're thinking, in a fictitious way, you're doing something now that you think is going to happen in the future, and so it's no different than, well, it is different, but it resembles, let's put it that way, of present value or future value valuation. So this family resemblance is really important, particularly since financialization is that important thing. So as such, a central problem fictitious capital poses is not, as the Austrian school approach has it, Mies, Hayek, the existence of prior savings, that it is not the existence of savings sufficient to allow the creation of supplementary capital. The problem is actually that fictitious capital preempts the future valorization process, even as it makes it invisible. So you can see within the context of a dynamic element that in the preemption, in making it more concrete, it becomes more abstract. I think that's the point that we were making before with notions of subsumption, not simply in the Marxian sense, but also in the move from Hegel to Marx, etc. That this is that movement that we, and similarly what Wolff talks about the logic that Marxism is different from Keynesianism, etc., that the logic moves in one direction, for example, in a Keynesian or in a neoclassical model, whereas in a Marxian model, it moves both ways. So this describes the that kind it resembles that kind of process. That is, fictitious capital preempts future valorization, even as it makes it invisible. So you have abstract. Uh, it is ghost-like to go all the way back a couple of weeks. That it is palpable on the one hand at one level, uh, but is also, more abstract, more invisible. So yes, it has, uh, ontological implications, but that's, you see, that fits into the historical path we're on. That is, we do many more things that function in, for example, the imaginary, but the imaginary is not necessarily consciousness, not necessarily consciousness. So, if, according to the Austrian approach, fictitious capital is synonymous with failure and wastage, which also is can be valorized. In the Marxist analysis, its fictitious character is not synonymous with the success or failure of the future valorization process, even though it does indicate its fragility. So that's kind of a thing, and this is how it becomes, as it were, semiotic. That is, you have a not direct or not identical, maybe even not contiguous relationship between past and future. So it gets us all the way back to our quantum sort of issues. So, in short, it poses the present valorization of money capital as a stake in future economic and political processes, and et cetera, et cetera. Uh, so, Marx identified, and I'm just rehearsing this because it is, we need to identify some of the units at work because it is a unit measurement or a unit of analysis. It will become that when we get to, this is not quantum yet, let's put it that way. What we're seeing here is that there is some structural similarities in what Marx is talking about in the relation of circuits of capital, movements among circuits of capital, and as I noted before, there is a kind of system of nested sets of these circuits. Each circuit is kind of, as it were, a layer that exists in our big, confection, a millefeuille, and that they're not identical. But they do describe some of the basic elements that we're going to look at. And so I reorganized some of the stuff, and hopefully that will become clearer as we move further along. So on this point, as with others, think, for example, of the manifesto's prophetic pages on globalization. Marx displayed staggering capacities of foresight, for while credit money and financial markets occupied only a limited place in his era, today they are at the very heart of the functioning of economies. Credit money may seem the form most difficult to identify as a series of fictitious capital. Is it not interest-bearing capital rather than fictitious capital? A matter of idle funds whose owners want to lend them in exchange for interest. The correct answer is that credit money shares characteristics with both these types of finance capital. So what does that mean for us? It means that you could measure things relative to interest measurements, etc., and sort of the 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 movement of capital as interest rates or interest changes. But the problem, of course, is that they don't all resolve themselves identically. They don't all come together, and it sort of exists as these complex flows. So it begins with what But to look in a more particular case, it begins with a bank loan, which, having been a simple monetary sign, becomes money through circulation. That is, go in the bank, get money. But this circulation itself largely results from an ex nihilo creation. That is, this is that point about how fictitious capital has a quantum-like element to it. That is, it is an advance on a future revenue and essentially does not come from previously saved funds. This is where credit and debt emerge. So the generalization of credit money since the mid-20th century implies the a priori canonization of private labor as social labor. This resolves in some ways, the some labor theory of value issues, and it's just not the same as the 19th century. It is more in that sense. It is another layer in that sense. Firms' production and the labor of worker borrowers is pre-validated by money before commodities are actually sold or wages actually paid. So this fits into this idea of, there's the labor market, labor power as the commodity in that sense, wages as the sort of the result of sort of finishing a contract, etc., doing the work. The generalization of this type of credit, which has long sustained economic growth, is made possible by a certain regularity of economic activities. Indeed, deposits rely on the promise that it would be possible to withdraw them in the form of notes issued by the central bank, demand deposits. Yet, no bank is able to keep to this promise if a large number of depositors want to withdraw their money simultaneously, right? Bank runs. This is, the precursor to, recession, depression, etc., market crashes, etc. So after all, except for reserve funds, all deposits are nothing but numbers without any immediately available counterpart. If there's a lack of confidence in a particular bank, and even more so when there's a lack of confidence in the banking system in general, only the central bank, which has the supreme monetary power of issuing the money that serves as the bank's reserve fund. And note, of course, that the reserve fund is what went south in the Great Depression. I mean, that's the argument, at least, the standard story that's told in money and banking classes. So, is able to prevent or contain the financial panic. This evidences both the hierarchical nature of money as an institution and the political regulation associated with fictitious capital. Credit money's fictitious dimension and its political anchoring are both accentuated by the fact that the government bonds that commercial banks sell to central banks under repurchase agreements constitute a sizable part of the raw materials serving private banks' creation of credit money. There's something there, let's put it that way. Now, they appear fictive in the sense that, they're just money moving around, numbers moving around, but they have, certain implications that they don't completely disappear. This is the way fictional capital operates. So in 2010 to 2012, the banking public debt crisis spiral in the countries of the European periphery forcefully illustrated the destructive power of such an imbrication. Here, the important question was the European Central Bank's refusal to commit to any unconditional automatic repurchase of the various countries' public debts. Now, this was handled slightly differently in the American context. This not only cut off the peripheral countries' access to financial markets, but simultaneously led to a rapid devalorization of bonds. We had that threat going on, recently. This in turn massively weakened the banks who held large volumes of these titles. The lack of any such guarantee brutally demonstrated the single currency's fundamental policy shortfalls. Politics, this is Duran's position. Politics is credit money's guarantor of last resort. It alone can allow the controlled expansion of credit money and prevent it from abruptly contracting in turbulent periods. The fictitious character of public debt is more immediately apparent. Indeed, it does not have any counterpart in capital valorized through production processes. Even if the expenses financed by debt do relate to an investment in infrastructure or the education system, they really have no direct monetary return to which the repayments correspond. This is the whole point of the idea the idea that there's some expectation that you will do better if you're more educated, which of course some people, because their need to subjugate or dominate, want certain other people to be more not so smart, and hence say class divisions, etc. That's oversimplifying, of course. Certainly, the state holds financial assets, that is, debts and shares, and a physical estate, but essentially, the latter, the physical estate, is not supposed to be ceded. Ultimately, even though the financial management of state assets is becoming increasingly important in the current context, in particular through the selling off of the family jewels in the context of austerity plans, it it uh, it is claims on the amount of future taxation that dominate public debt. People obsess about that. And it obviously affects whole bunches of things. Moreover, the principal on the debt is never repaid because new issuing is constantly used to compensate the payment of securities reaching maturity. It's just the market at work, the financial market at work. The fact that government bonds are tradable further perfects their fetish character. You can see how this gets back to Marx. For the individual bondholder, the fiction becomes a reality when he finds a buyer for his bonds. But these bonds do not in themselves have any direct counterpart in the valorization process. They are advances on tax receipts. This singular characteristic of liquidity, which is this has always been the problem, right? This is the underlying Keynesian question. Mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, is as essential to market-listed stocks and corporate bonds exchanged on the financial markets. Unlike public debt, these latter do indeed represent a real capital. Capital invested by firms are used in their operations. Here it is the duplication implicit in the financial mode of valorization that is at the origin of the fiction. That is, but the capital that does not exist twice over. Once as the capital value of ownership titles and shares, and then again as the actual capital invested or to be invested in the enterprises in question, exists only in the latter form. And the share is nothing but an ownership pro rata to the surplus value which this capital is to realize. So, the same is true of company bonds, albeit with the difference that here it is a matter of credits and not property titles, and the capitalized revenues are thus interest, not dividends or really accumulated capital. So I've showed you at the front end Table 1, which shows the categories of fictitious capital. So there's company bonds that have interest flows, public debt, which has interest flows, and shares, stock shares, etc., dividend flows, and ownership over the productive capital that firms will accumulate. So these are very basic categories, but the point is that some things are tradable, other things are not. So, Table 1 offers a simple presentation of the basic forms of fictitious capital. It underlines the various bases of this fiction and the various different modalities through which it is constituted as an economic object. In the case of bank credit, and more precisely the credit issued by banks beyond their reserve funds, the fiction rests on the fact that no revenue has been received in advance and on the anticipation of a future accumulation process. Nonetheless, this fiction is regulated insofar as the foreseen repayments are meant to be compatible with what is considered the normal development of business. With traditional bank credit, the banks hold on to the debts so that they're not subject to a reevaluation process. This broad category of bank credit also includes commercial credits that banks acquire from companies in transactions discounting intercompany debts. Remember, a lot of this is about accounting, and it becomes problematic when you, well, anyway, there is a literature for it. In the case of public debt, the fiction derives from the fact that bonds do not correspond to any real capital accumulation process, but simply to advances on future tax receipts, receipts that themselves depend on the revenues that economic agents will draw from future economic activity. Now, however, the tradability of these debt titles, like the tradability of shares and bonds, introduces a new dimension that gives fictitious capital its full power. That is, its liquidity. A tradable equity simultaneously represents both access to earnings flows and a wealth that can be at any instant be converted into real money at prices corresponding to the financial community's self-referential estimation of expected future returns. The fictitious character of capital in the form of tradable equities brings us back to the paradox of liquidity. That while banking crises correspond to a lack of a posteriori validation of credit money and manifest themselves in bank runs, financial crises translate into the stock market collapses that occur when too many agents try to offload their securities simultaneously. So there is this family resemblance, but not identical because they're kind of happening at different ends of the process or different places in the process. So, in sum, this is Duran. In sum, fictitious capital is an incarnation of that which tends to free itself from the process of valorization through production. According to the Marxist approach, capital is fictitious to the extent that it circulates without production yet having been realized, representing a claim on a future real valorization process. So this is why, and the necessity, and the problem of large-scale capitalist operations is they do need regulation. They do need the state to do something to manage things like the debt. Today, this fictitious capital can rely on public authorities' support, in particular the support of central banks. As they take action in favor of financial stability, these latter affect a social pre-validation of the accumulation process by way of fictitious capital. So my point here, and the reason why Duran is important, is to identify that there's something more material going on, and that it does represent, as it were, a whole bunch of other things that we might normally, say, well, that's not quite as palpable. It does have implications relative to our ability to put up a building or, zone an area. Money is still involved. It's just at a slight remove in that sense, and no different than the remove of credit and debt. There are approaches to capital which would explain circuits of capital, because that's sort of the point of this, is that the circuits are operating, but they don't operate all at the same speed, you know, and amplitude, etc. They're not all like, it's not a simple set of wheels. It is, much more complicated than that, using readings that use a quantum political economic approach to reformulating a theory of capital. This includes conceptualizing rent as capital. It's not purely capital, of course, but it is a form of capital. And then what I've added more recently is the critical legal studies approach that includes analyzing the relationship of rights to capital, as in development rights. So I was mentioning that before about how when you transfer, rights to various pieces of real estate, or, as it were, conceptual pieces of real estate, that is air rights. uh, it is an obvious abstraction on the one hand. On the other hand, it is concretized, and more effectively concretized in the urban context because of concentration. So, a model employing intersecting layers of a single dynamic system where legal rights act as the wave function. So, legal rights are a portion of the way in which you think about, you know, how things sort of move around, that collapses into specific economic realities like rent and profit. Rent and profit are economic realities. They're, they're numbers on the one hand. On the other hand, with legal elements, they become more palpable, right? I mean, it's pretty clear if just pay your bills upon measurement, that is market transactions. And of course, hopefully when you see, this operates within the context of capitalism, when people buy other people's debt or sell off credit, elements that represent credit, or that are credit or accumulated savings, etc. So there's all this stuff going on. Capital exists, therefore, in a state of superposition until measured. This moment of measurement, right, by a market event or legal ruling. So, this happens in fairly simple ways. On the other hand, highly complex ways. What is the market price, etc. of things, market rate, whatever. Testing whether by treating development rights as quantum superpositions that are collapsed into rent through legal measurement formulate a theory where rent is capital. Now, rent is, simply uh, uh, it's a money, but it's important to think of it, and particularly in times of recession, etc., as problematic forms of credit or debt. Unger's system, that is Roberto Unger, is one of the major people, or one of a variety of a group of people that constitute critical legal studies, and talks about rights as broken up, or that it has certain subcategories or variations that are called immunity rights, destabilization rights, market rights, and solidarity rights. So these are different aspects. And with due respect, these are the kinds of things that Charles Sanders Peirce would normally talk about in terms of firstness, secondness, and thirdness. That is, these are variations on one's ability to do a certain type of thing, whether one is immune or that something is decentered or stabilized. And of course, there's more generalizable elements as well. So recognition that accepted social constructs, including private property, often have the effect of insulating power from challenge. This is kind of how Trump operates, right? That he manipulates the legal system in order to insulate himself from actual accountability, and he does it with lawfare. But it doesn't mean that we all have to go out suing everyone else. But making a demand relative to a tort on some imagined or real damage is part of the whole unfortunate system, or at least the American system. And his consequent demand for what he calls destabilization rights still resonate. So, understanding the ability of power to reassert itself and coalesce in liquid markets is essential to effective planning and design of institutional and regulatory frameworks. So, this is an article on Unger. It's a synthesizing of Unger's ideas without having to go through a whole business of explaining Unger. In order to achieve the plasticity that Unger speaks of, new forms of rights and institutions are required. These rights are designed to advance the emancipation of the individual. One of these rights Unger calls destabilization rights, which operate as self-disrupting structures that permit transformative action and context smashing in the service of a more inclusive, egalitarian, and ennobling society. So, large-scale organizations that ingrain forms of social practice that are unaffected by ordinary destabilizing effects sustain insulated hierarchies of power and advantage. Thus, destabilization rights protect citizens' interests by breaking open these entrenched institutions in areas of practice. In other words, asserting your individual rights, your right not to have pull you over, drag you out of your car, and shoot you. That's a more extreme version, but you know, obviously rights are being trampled on. But in concert, you know, uh, the public sphere is affected because people are outraged by what appears to be, uh, in another context, carjacking. That is, people unidentified wearing masks, carrying firearms, drag you out of your car without identifying themselves, or even if they identify themselves, they could be lying. Uh, they don't have quite the same constitutional, uh, uh, context in which they're working. So anyway, in a quantum view, destabilization rights uncollapse the wave function, returning the asset to a state of superposition where new values can be negotiated. So you can see that even in you know, the current context where um, values are being manipulated by virtue of people's rights being either amplified or crushed, it reaches a new state where you can't rely. It's unfortunate, but there's an evolutionary element to it where new agreements, new contracts, new social constructs need to be created. So the LLM view of this is the collapse is not inevitable, but a political choice allowing for the reimagining of rights via destabilization to alter the flow of capital. So there's a capital implication. This moves the analysis from how capital moves to how the rules of the game create the possibility of value itself. So you can see that it's operating at a slightly different level, but raises certain foundational elements. Now, I included a part of Simon Clark's discussion of Marx's 3 volumes of Capital, and I don't want to go through all of this directly, but I just took a couple of paragraphs from it. Marx's main concern is to show in a systematic and rigorous way that circulation is subordinate to production, that capitalist social relations are rooted in production rather than in circulation, that the role of circulation is to provide a mechanism that can, through the exchange of products and the operation of markets, ensure that the commodities of particular types, particular use values, are produced in the quantities and the proportions required for the reproduction of the system. Thus, the market serves to coordinate the different branches of capitalism. It regulates the social division of labor in a capitalist society as in simple commodity production. So one would assert that all we are doing is putting another layer on the same cake. The point is that production still is important, and what you are producing in a you have to ask what is being produced in Department 2. Things are being produced. They're not simply circulated. They are being produced in their circulation. One has to rethink that, and it is the crux of a lot of people's problems with defenses of labor theory of value, et cetera, et cetera. understanding surplus value, etc. You know, they see it more static, and it is more dynamic. It shifts because of, as it were, these quantum elements where you reconfigure things sort of on the fly. But it's not really on the fly. It's structurally sound. It's just happening, at different paces, different amplitude, different speed, et cetera, et cetera. And like physics, it's, hard to account for all those things. Now, the point is, of course, to rethink commodification, because you would say at the Marxist point that commodities exist at some third point after production, distribution. You know, they exist in some other form that ultimately gets consumed, of course, in a consumer society, but that the commodities shift. There are other commodities. Let's put it that way. I mean, you can talk about money commodities because that's what Marx talks about. But the point of money, as MMT has presented, etc., is that there are other forms at which you can start talking about stuff, and you don't necessarily have to talk about Marx. You just need to deal with this commodity form that is money in the MMT context. So, what one does in building a model is to move from kind of these metaphors, these many metaphors, circuits, etc., to operationalize research, and that one component, and not the determining component, is just another determination, another entry point, as Wolf would say, of regulatory effects and legal rights and property are just one element. Now, you could say that uh, uh, social ownership or social welfare of certain elements of property and of certain rights are easier to manage if one has a more monopoly position. That is, more socialism allows for greater distribution or redistribution of income and wealth, etc. People object to that because you worry that my social contract is being broken because I'm more of a libertarian and I should have more rights to my stuff as a matter of self-governance. But you do live in a society. The atomization, the thing that people worry about in methodological individualism is this. It is a fictitious notion in that sense, that it is a specter. So, on one level, then, the indeterminacy thesis is the recognition of the otherness of the Hegelian concept that disrupts totality and opens the chasm between meaning and being. And this is also what Peirce has called secondness. Now, this is problematic for all. This is Drusilla Cornell's viewpoint on this, and it it's not really very controversial in the sense that, there is a family resemblance between Charles Sanders Peirce's issues about how things work and other ways in which we can talk about culture, talk about communication, talk about objects, and talk about a money system, which is why Peirce is interested in economy. So, anyway, this may take us further afield, but the point is that the language with which we operate here is one that is not a secret language. Quantum is not a secret language. It is talking about certain other processes that are part of building a model. That is, you have to do some recoding or secondary coding or whatever, retconning, certain elements to get it to work to get a model to work properly. So that's part of it. So I chose a quantum approach to international relations that, like many other international relations, there's all kinds of things that they do that are overgeneralizations of global events and processes that are, on the one hand, very interesting to read about and to think about, but are problematic when you begin to apply them to actual history, actual reality. This is where, a more materialist approach would be necessary. But it is, it has, by virtue of its academic power, I suppose, a certain interesting, not only interdisciplinary, but uh, a certain institutional place, you know. And you wouldn't have, uh, with all due respect, uh, the UN, the United Nations, if it weren't for or consonant to international relations. So anyway, Derderian and Wendt put together a little anthology of articles that discuss these kinds of things. So what they deal with is the idea of applying quantum systems for, as it were, computing, communications, control, and artificial intelligence. So what they're suggesting is all of those things are entangled, combined, because that's kind of what it is. This is the simple step on the path of, all of those other technocratic things that we were looking at. That, you know, technocracy occurs before computers, but it's clearly at work in how we're dealing with now artificial intelligence, for example. So there are at least four different pathways to the development of quantum computers. That is superconducting, trapped ion, silicon dot, and topological. Now, you know, we can spend a great deal of time trying to explain that, but the point is that there are variations on this. But fundamental to all of them is the quantum bit or qubit, which entangled in all possible states of superposition provides an exponential advantage over classical computers, and yes, computers that we normally use, like our microcomputers or our phones, are based on digital bits in binary states of either 0 or 1. Now, the almost unimaginable increase in computational power, that is, one quantum computer with 300 qubits could perform more calculations than there are atoms in the universe, would provide profound advantages in strategically vital areas, including encryption and decryption. I think you can imagine that, hopefully. Radar and sensors, navigation and targeting. This is where artificial intelligence comes in, because you can make calculations occur faster, you make decisions quicker, and already, drone technology is using AI in terms of, adjusting for targeting, et cetera, et cetera. And then simulation and data mining, machine learning and pattern recognition. So, Google, IBM, Microsoft, and other major high-tech giants have been in competition over the past several years to achieve, the beauty of capitalism, quantum supremacy, the somewhat hyperbolic term coined by theoretical physicist John Preskill to describe the moment when a quantum computer proves capable of executing tasks impossible for the most powerful supercomputer. See, there is, this massive competition that may or may not be won by the United States versus China, and whatever. But about building supercomputers, and lest you think that's unimportant, they're very necessary for doing certain kinds of things like weather calculation and stuff like that. Like large number prime factoring, the basis of most classical encryption, multivariable optimization, like the traveling salesman problem, or the simulation of complex many-body systems, like astronomical bodies. For better or worse, the number of players in this game is limited by the staggering cost of developing quantum technologies, which commonly involves supercooling, that is, a single, quantum computing chip generates an intolerable amount of heat, so that most of the size of a quantum computer really is about its cooling system. But anyway, supercooling, shielded facilities, rare materials, which is also part of these, you know, rare earth stuff, and considerable financial as well as intellectual capital. So there's all these things going on at a fairly extreme level. And there is some anticipation of this. This whole idea of massive data centers is not simply about regular computing, but it is about trying to adjust for some anticipation. And it's not about AI. It's about faster and bigger, faster that faster computers that necessitate a certain. Let's put it that way. Now, this leaves the geopolitical field primarily open to superpowers like the United States and China. However, the European Union and middle powers like Australia, Canada, India, Japan, and Singapore pursuing comparative advantages through collaborative research and development projects are clearly in pursuit of a step change through quantum technology that might well register as an increase in geopolitical status, which is what in international relations people are really concerned about. Alongside and in some cases out ahead of the U.S. tech firms, Alibaba, Baidu, and Quantum's C-Tech in China are pouring billions into quantum computation and communication, often in concert with state-financed initiatives based at leading universities, etc. So there will be quantum haves and quantum have-nots. There will be, the weaponizing of quantum, particularly in the application of quantum AI and intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance. ISR has already begun, as I just mentioned. Deep in defense departments and under the darkness of classified programs in spy agencies, memos are probably already circulating about the coming RQMA, or Revolution in Quantum Military Affairs. And yes, quantum effects, once thought of confined to the subatomic level, have already been shown to scale up to the biological, cognitive, and human behavioral levels. And this is kind of where we are at the present moment. That is, quantum math, particularly as it's widely dispersed, it moves in those areas. That's why Bayesian stuff is important, because you can apply the kind of probability things to certain other elements, things that might have public health implications. Let's put it that way. Or put another way, when observational practices and visual imagery transmitted in near simultaneity through densely networked systems of multiple media produce powerful superpositional effects as well as entangled effects, the heuristic advantage of quantum over classical approaches becomes increasingly difficult to refute. I mean, this is just the difference between one version, where we are in the fourth or fifth industrial revolution, to what under quantum probably becomes a fifth or sixth industrial revolution. Now, of course, there's all kinds of other historical issues going on there, and some of us won't be alive to see it. And to preempt the predictable retort, come the day of a quantum convergence between human intelligence and artificial intelligence, shall we deem it quantum-like or human-like? Well, Derderian kind of is, prosaic, I suppose. So it goes to the next thing, talking about metaphors, and a quantum approach could well become the most realist. There's a whole thing about realism and critical realism, as well as other kinds of realism at work in social scientific theories as well as scientific theories. It will then fall upon those in the social sciences upholding worldviews based on the motions of planets, pulleys, and billiard balls to defend their concepts. This is sort of a swipe at people who do engage in certain analytic models, or to recognize them as, and this is where metaphors come in, metaphors whose metaphorical nature has been forgotten. At this emergent stage, we believe it best to practice an open pluralism on the critical question of when, how, and at what scale quantum behavior is actual, potential or merely metaphorical. So, there's, uh, I probably put in too long a thing here. The point is that ideas of superposition and entanglement are kind of holistic points. That is, the properties even existence of the parts depend in top down fashion on the whole rather than on the other way around, as in the classical worldview. This is similar to, of course, the analogy, not made by Marx, of superstructure and base. So, this is a way in which we can invert, as it were, this distinction, and not to refute, and not refuting at all, uh, uh, the original assumption, because you need them both. You can't have one without the other. So, one of the major lights, or at least one of the first movers, David Orrell, and uh, is has written a fair amount, and I assume he's going to, you know, make great progress, etc. He's his current, I think, research deals with quantum money, and which, with all due respect, has other problematic elements relative to crypto money, etc., etc. It's not identical to it, but it has implications for it. But I think it's based, as well, in this technology, the speed of things. So, but he's written a little bit of the early work. He's a mathematician by training, on quantum stuff, quantum propensity in economics, more specifically, or economics and some sort of quantum economic stuff. And it has tended, as I mentioned several weeks ago, to identify itself with certain neoclassical economic problems. And you could that's a fairly narrow point of view, in the sense that Keynesianism, which you could one argue that is merely a variation on the neoclassical model, uh, but identifies certain problems with the neoclassical model that, of course, implied that that there's problems with it, about particularly on the issue of liquidity, and so quantum liquidity might be an interesting problem. I would That's kind of where quantum money will probably be worked out. But anyway, there are two areas in which quantum technology is likely to have relevance for the discipline. That is, number one, the use of quantum computing, the you know quantum computers as opposed to classical computers, to solve and estimate economic models. That's pretty logical. And number two, though, this is the important element, the use of quantum communication to construct forms of currency called quantum money. Now, it's unfortunate because we're currently at a stage where, crypto money is largely used to uh, rob people, or to do certain other things. Quantum money may achieve that as well, but they're not identical, which have novel properties that cannot be achieved without exploiting quantum phenomena. So, on the one hand, we have technological advancement. On the other, we have the possibility that it will be abused. Um, I put in a thing here that is probably too complicated in terms of discussing how some of the mathematical implications of it. So, but one can say that there's implications for cognitive. There are cognitive issues that underlie this, and that are a new kind of logic. But let me skip to the conclusion. In early neoclassical economics, utility was viewed as a kind of energy. In his 1892 book, Mathematical Investigations of the Theory of Value and Prices, Irving Fisher, for example, recall that Irving Fisher is problematic relative to well, the Great Depression. But anyway, Irving Fisher, for example, expressed economic transactions in physical terms where utility had units of energy. It's sort of the next step in that sense to discuss it anyway. But the quantum framework returns to this idea of energy, but associates it with a change in propensity rather than a utility. So this is a different way of thinking about use and exchange value. With all due respect, the propensity has sort of expectation implications as it were. Well, previous works have demonstrated the usefulness of quantum methods in modeling cognitive phenomena. The propensity approach allows us to view economic transactions in general as a quantized, probabilistic system of the sort simulated in quantum computing. So, this is where the bridge occurs between classical economics and quantum economics. So, of course, many social scientists will argue that it is inappropriate to quantify things like social power or mental energy, because that's kind of where the literature is because of the use of quantum modeling to apply to, certain uh, uh, behavioral kinds of research. So you could argue that in experimental economics you would largely be doing, from a quantum point of view, uh, uh, behavioral expectations or the psych stuff, the Kahneman, etc., applied. So, however, one consequence of the rational, well, since they cannot be reduced to exact equations, that's the problem of trying to quantify things like social power or mental energy as an exact equation. Well, yes and no, because there are ways of doing it. We don't need to go down that road, but that is happening already anyway, in terms of mapping it, blah blah blah. However, one consequence of the rational utility optimizing picture is that complex social topics, such as power relationships, were downplayed or ignored. Since economics is a quantitative discipline, we need a suitable framework with which to describe the interplay between objective and subjective forces that make up power. Now, there's a whole literature for this now, the kind of power and capital literature, but we won't talk about that for the moment. A main contribution of the quantum approach is to connect power with propensity. While human motivations cannot be reduced to equations, it seems reasonable to quantify the propensity for a person to make a particular decision, and yes, you can make equations out of that. Indeed, this is the entire basis for fields such as I just mentioned, behavioral economics. The entropic force, along with its associated energy, is merely another way of expressing a propensity function. The approach can be used to simulate a variety of economic phenomena, from cognitive interference in the decision-making process to the price of financial options. This is the more ethereal elements of financial business math. But that's where some people are pushing it. Now, whether it really actually resolves anything is a whole other different question, and whether it becomes profitable is a whole other question as well. But to summarize, neoclassical economics was marked by a switch. I wouldn't say that it's a switch, it's a building on, a layering from a labor theory of value to one based on utility. And we've already argued this point out in methodological individualism, etc., etc. And you sort of need both in order to work through the problem anyway. But anyway, quantum economics make a similar switch by expressing value in terms of a propensity function. Now, the point, of course, in this sentence is that it's not all value as a propensity function, because there is a kind of deterministic problem making that claim. But anyway, adopting a quantum probabilistic framework allows us to incorporate cognitive effects such as interference, and entanglement, express basic economic quantities such as forces of supply and demand. You can see it's already built into a neoclassical framework, inconsistent units, and consider both subjective and objective factors on an equal footing. Well, yes and no. I mean, this is probably, from a quantitative point of view, the way in which you try to measure, as it were, certain kinds of subjectivities. Now, the problematic element of this is that, people will use it for a variety of other insidious purposes, mainly political power and domination. And it's kind of why, the putting everyone into databases is really interesting on the one hand because efficiency is improved. On the other hand, it's more to exploit, but that's a whole other thing. So it got me sidetracked on the issue of metaphors and models and how to be able to uh, put them together or to discriminate between one and the other because it's a literature I looked at in terms of theory building decades ago, but you got to come back to it, I suppose. But metaphors as models are cognitive tools that are undergoing constant retooling processes. So, without rehearsing the whole article, it's a good article. It's a chapter actually in a book. Uh, Recent work by philosophers and historians of science on modeling practices in different scientific disciplines shows the importance of understanding the role of metaphors and analogical models in the dynamics and organization of science, including its epistemic organization, which requires going beyond the linguistic role of metaphors. So it's already reductive in that sense. Metaphors and analogies form part of a web of cognitive and epistemic artifacts scaffolding the development of abstract concepts, models, and narratives, which are science forming, as Maxwell said. So the point is that, ultimately, he boils it down to the need for more structural analysis, um, which it mirrors, the issues in social science of structural questions. So it's not that different. Um, but it does move into certain areas about cognitive science and more specifically, uh, the notion of several philosophers of science like Mary Hesse. And Hesse argued in dozens of publications for almost 5 decades about the importance of rethinking the relation between metaphors, analogies, and models, and above all, the need to unveil epistemic presuppositions in traditional discussions about models. So this is a sort of a cautionary tale to talk about, well, you want to structure it better, but you also realize, it's the prison house of language. So you sort of want to work through many of the problems that often are, as we've looked at in our semiotics sort of stuff, is the reduction to language models of one kind or another, or making language linguistic in that sense. Um, so anyway, the other thing I was looking at, and yes, this may seem like it doesn't relate, but it actually does, um, is because it relates to issues that we would relate to in terms of fictitious, fictitious capital, is to return to assessments and a more very recent assessment of David Harvey's work and some newer ways in which Harvey's arguments get structured. So there's a dissertation done at Lund uh, on land rent, capital, rate of profit, a critique of Harvey's model of urban land rent. Now, I know that seems tedious on the one hand, and I will probably go through the abstract fairly quickly, but the notion here, and this is where it comes back to radical political economy, is the notion of turbulence. Because we've sort of dealt with that earlier on, is that by making things more probabilistic, uh, entangled, superposition, uh, you know, we're looking at a certain kind of churning that we could describe as turbulence, which is the way that Anwar Sheikh looks at economics of a macro sort. So, land rent capital rate of profit compares the explanatory power of Harvey's spatial monopoly model of land rent with a proposed turbulent intersectoral model of land rent, so SMLR versus TILR, with their analysis of economic urbanization process by uncovering the SMLR's theoretical and empirical inconsistencies. The study argues that the SMLR suffers from the following empirical inconsistencies. And this is important because this has relevance for our discussions of rent as capital, um, development rights, a whole bunch of other things. They're all built into these sets of problems. Um, the model offer that is SMLR offers limited analytic tools for empirical research on rent rates, ceilings, and magnitudes. This you could argue that in fact this is probably the greatest limitation, one of the greater limitations about the empirical extension of David Harvey's work, and that's for a whole variety of probably more institutional and historical reasons. But anyway, number two, the model offers inadequate economic mechanisms for macro level patterns of rent creation and appropriation. It offers an inadequate explanation for the historical contingency of macro level and micro level rent creation and appropriation. And four, it breaks with its structural starting points and does not offer endogenous structural analysis of rent creation and appropriation. Now, you could argue that David Harvey wasn't that interested in it, or that, and it's not that it wasn't out of his quantitative capabilities. I think he just needed a bigger army of graduate students. But anyway, the TILR resolves these inconsistencies by incorporating an intersectoral and multiscalar framework and bringing in the concept of absolute land rent. You see, absolute land rent returns, even though some people, don't want to talk about it for a variety of reasons. It assumes certain power relations that that or whatever, or that we only see in intermediate form. But anyway, um, so I added to this some things about what capital looks like to remind us that there are different aspects to different forms of appearance of capital. That is how it's differentiated and distributed. So, industrial capital, commercial capital, money dealing capital, which is divided into landowning capital and financial capital. And of course, that these things are intertwined in the urban context. So, the concrete manifestation of these forms are below in different columns: agriculture, etc., insurance, etc., trade, blah, 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 trading banks, investment banks, and real estate. So, you can actually begin to distinguish the sort of tangibility, as it were, the tangible versus intangible elements. And, that's a very simple way of thinking about, well, what does capital look like? Capital looks like all of these things. And these little variations, in fact, are, what keep economists and city planners and et cetera busy, is trying to work through all of these kinds of questions. And, obviously government is involved in that process. Now, what is fully integrated into this model of capital is, of course, labor process. And you need to think about it from capital points of view. That is, there are constant and variable capital, that they are combined relative to things like fixed capital on the left, surplus value on the right, and fluid capital. So there's something that combines all of these matters, and it is, of course, how we represent these things to other things. That is the interchange that we make among circuits, and labor is involved in all of those things. In some cases, computers make it faster, but it's still ultimately, humans are somewhere in the process. And so labor, of course, in the Marxian model, in the simple Marxian model, or the basic Marxian model, has some implication about commodity or commodifying certain things. Like labor power is already a first abstraction, an estimation of your capital worth, or as the neoclassical economists would say, human capital, which is commodified. And so there's other things that I've included in here, more complicated things, but I also wanted to include, just for tedium's sake, I suppose, is what economic reproduction looks like, which is, of course, a multi-phase or multi-channel or, you know, you know, periodic kind of operating of the relationship between capital and money. Uh, now, now then, the point I wanted to make with this is that surplus value still is being produced, but it is being produced not within the cycle, but in the move between subsequent cycles. That's what I would assert here. Is that the little arrows here are that it is not estimate. This is the question of present things estimated, but they're it is talking about future value, and so surplus value has that is that possibility or that result, and it manifests itself in a variety of things. You know, rates of return, interest rates, et cetera, et cetera. And so profit has that relationship. It's not identical to surplus value, but it is, you know, profit is one manifestation of surplus value among many others. And so there are stages at which one can talk about this even in a land context. So this is a Ricardian sort of view about what you do, you know, in terms of what lies fallow in every period. David Harvey stuff, um, and of course the one I was talking about ages ago about the sort of logical argument or path from, you know, the front end about the commodity going through all of these different degrees of abstraction and ultimately coming up with, you know, the buying and selling of labor power, and then capital's, you know, fight conflict with labor, and then ultimately class struggle, etc. So these are all, on the one hand, different models for thinking about capital, thinking about its accumulation, and a variety of other things. This is Harvey's sort of latest or last kind of model, which not that different than the other things. I think just over the years he began to, you know, other stuff. Rent, of course, is over here. It's a very, uh, uh, you know, small part on the one hand of the Department Two of distribution, but it's still an important part. Uh, Now, on both left and right, or the bottom right and upper left, are the gifts, the where gifts of nature occur. And so this is kind of the front end of the argument that I will make about, are there free gifts of capital? Are there free gifts of culture? And these are kinds of elements that actually impinge on sort of the meaning of many of these things. And I think you could see that in how things get reproduced, etc. Now, this all makes production, reproduction, and destruction of space, place, and nature. This is, you know, you could argue that this is somewhat reductive. On the other hand, uh, it is a way of straightening out various elements that exist in the world, in a material historical world, how all of these things sort of fit or don't fit together. So I asked some sort of a few more questions of the LLM. The rest here is LLM stuff. And it gave me some interesting elements. That is, there is a quaternary circuit. You could argue that there's a quaternary circuit, and I think that's quite possible to think about anyway. And that, and also the rent as capital, and of course, turbulent intersectoral flow, the the one I was just talking about the turbulence, suggests that rent flows dynamically and unpredictably between sectors driven by the volatility of legal rights and financial expectations. So that was the point I was making in surplus value moving between periods. This is how it operates. And as Anwar Sheikh talks about, it is turbulent in that sense. And so rights fit in that as a kind of destabilization. So Roberto Unger's concept of destabilization rights are crucial here. These are the rights designed to dismantle entrenched hierarchies and allow for, yes, the renegotiation of capital flows. This is the market at work on the one hand. On the other hand, it includes other things like lawfare, the courts, uh, politics, etc. In a quantum, destabilization rights uncollapse the wave function, returning the asset to a state of superposition where new values can be negotiated. So what we're describing here is the movement between cycles or among cycles, and there are other contingencies built into that, of course. So there's other charts and things that are combined, but suffice to say, I think I'm getting close to the end of my yammering. Um, as I used in this very old diagram that I borrowed. It's the same diagram. It just has a fourth element of circuit of advanced capital added to it. Um, and it's a perfect way to think about it that in fact there are these four layers of the standard uh, uh, Marxian equation um, that looks like this. So this is a multi-period MCP C prime M prime MCP C prime M prime MCP, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the linear version of that, but we need to think more spatially, not unlike Harvey, and think of it more as these, sort of nested sets. That is, there's a circuit of money capital, the M to M prime part, the circuit of advanced capital, the C to C prime part, the circuit of productive capital, the P, blah, 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 to P, from one P to next P, and then the circuit of commodity capital, which is C prime to C double prime, I would suppose. This is how the whole system sort of operates. And it's perfectly consonant with volume 2 of Capital, or I would assert that it is. And so in that sense, it's uncontroversial. On the other hand, there's always ways of arguing out the L part of the MP. And I also added on the discussions, because we're talking about circuits, of an article by Callum Ward on the secondary circuit of capital, which sort of explicates kind of why we're talking about multiple circuits. And so there's a little thing here. And what else did I close on? Oh, yeah, something much more dense, I suppose. But this is a continuation of the discussion of secondary circuits of capital. So I introduced with those four little panels above uh, circuits of capital, and you can see how this plays out. The subprime mortgage crisis is along with rents and other things, ways in which we can talk about circuits of capital. Though there's a thing there, and it's interesting in that it includes a variety of really interesting things. Like, I haven't seen Gottheiner's social production of space quoted in a very long time. I mean, aside from Lefebvre, but it's just interesting to come back to it. It's a semiotic model. Let's put it that way. I found it quite amusing to return to semiotic matters. And then I included the portion that I read above, the abstract, etc., from the 2021 dissertation by Farahani on this. And what else? Oh, I included because I wanted to explain, and you can maybe we'll do this later on. But in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, there is a page or a section on rights, and it doesn't include certain types of rights, but it does talk in general about the issue of first and secondary rights, which I find interesting because it can be applied to our little circuits problem above, um, and so you can actually create a model where your rights are both first order and second order. You have the power to waive, annul, and transfer your claim, against others, altering your claim, and then the point is you have a computer, but uh, at the first order you have certain rights, but there are other rights that are applied. So we're describing the diagram using a table. Anything in the second order column of the table can match anything in the first order column. The figure has arrows drawn from second order items, power and privilege, to one of the first order items, claim, which is what you would do in, making an argument, a logical argument. So you have power to waive, annul, or transfer your immunity against others, altering your privilege to use the computer. And then there's the claim against others using the computer. And so there are second order rights over the first order rights, and there are first order rights over the computer itself. So you have your little laptop and somebody cops it or something. Uh, there's certain powers that you have that are sort of at one level, but there's a whole other set of levels which deal, with all due respect, and has a family resemblance to the difference between verbal communication and nonverbal communication. For example, you put your coat on a chair to reserve your place, and of course, it's only psychos that would recognize that as a kind of property or right or claim on the chair on which you put your coat. But anyway, so and then oh yes. We get back to Basu and the inference that I was making before about Anwar Sheikh's new interpretation sort of pursuit that goes, past this in terms of Sheikh style price value comparisons. And so that's kind of where the current thing is. Um, I think I've gotten to the end. Maybe there was somebody listening. I will now, if I can do it, uh, turn off the live stream and then turn off